Today we're going to look at the author of The Lottery, Shirley Jackson. Now, Shirley Jackson was born in 1916 in San Francisco. She attended the University of Rochester and then Syracuse University, where she became the fiction editor of the campus humor magazine. She also wrote 6 novels, 2 memoirs, and over 200 short stories in her short lifetime. When she was going to the University of Rochester, she dropped out of college in her sophomore year. If she had stayed, she would have been a part of the class of 1938. Now, according to a biography about the author, dropped out isn't exactly the right term. Her grades were so bad that year that at the end of it, she was asked to leave. Now, in her biography, Ruth Franklin notes that of the author Shirley Jackson, the writer later commented that she had been kicked out because I refused to go to any classes, because I hated them. She spent the next year writing, forcing herself to produce at least 1,000 words a day, and when she applied to Syracuse University, she did so with the goal of making writing her career. Now, after graduating in 1940, Jackson moved to New York City, in particular Greenwich Village, and she began to write professionally. Now, in 1944, she and her husband then moved to Vermont, and in 1948, her first novel, The Road Through the Wall, was published. Now, as a side note, starting at this time, Ms. Jackson did spend some time in a mental hospital. She had troubled relationships, not only with her mother, but also with her husband. Now, as her first novel is published in 1948, you're going to be seeing other works appearing in the magazine The New Yorker, in Redbook, the Saturday Evening Post, and the Ladies' Home Journal. Now, her most famous work, the short story The Lottery, was published in 1948 in The New Yorker. Now, in 1949, she had gathered enough money, so she relocates to Westport, Connecticut. Now, in 1959, her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, was published and is considered one of the best haunted house stories ever to be written. Now, the tone of most of her works is odd and macabre, with an impending sense of doom, often framed by very ordinary settings and characters. Shirley Jackson herself was the mother of 4 children, but she was also a reclusive woman. For the last few years of her life, she's reluctant to discuss her work with the public. And by the time she reached age 48, she died of heart failure in 1965. Now, arguably her most famous short story is The Lottery, and there was quite the public reaction in 1948 to it. The short story is said to have generated more negative letters from readers than any other story previously published by the magazine, and many canceled their subscriptions to the magazine. Readers were offended by the work and its suggestion that evil could be so easily and commonly carried out. They felt the ending was a pointless, arbitrary, and violent sacrifice. Now, a few readers actually called the magazine to see where the town was. They wanted to go and watch The Lottery. And Shirley Jackson states that she received over 300 letters that summer alone. And she says, quote, "I can count only 13 that spoke kindly to me." Now, her own parents had reactions to the story of The Lottery. She said, "Even my own mother scolded me. Dad and I did not care at all for your story. It does seem, dear, that this gloomy kind of story is what all you young people think about these days. Why don't you write something to cheer people up?" Now, her own reaction to the public's reaction of the story The Lottery is generally nothing. She refused to explain the meaning of the story. But she did once tell a journalist, "I suppose I hoped by setting a particularly brutal rite in the present and in my own village to shock the readers with a graphic demonstration of the pointless violence and general inhumanity of their own lives. But I gather that in some cases the mind just rebels. The number of people who expected Mrs. Hutchinson to win a Bendix washer at the end would amaze you." So when we look at the meaning behind the plot, we usually look at the sense of what it means to be a human sacrifice, or the scapegoat. For example, in ancient Athens, Greece, Athenians believed that human sacrifice promised fertile crops. By transferring one's sins to persons or animals, and then sacrificing them, people believed that their sins would be eliminated, a process that has been termed scapegoat. And a ritual sacrifice occurs with Tetchy Hutchinson and the statement in the story, "Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon." Now, the lottery was written in 1948. Now, Shirley Jackson's writing would have been influenced by the world events and culture. She had already gone through the Depression, and a lot of the stories and movies that were coming out in America at that time showed this impending sense of doom with the very common characters who just couldn't get out of their predicaments. She was likely also influenced by the Holocaust and World War II, as we start hearing in 1943 in the United States about the Holocaust that was going on with all the concentration camps in Europe. That possibly influenced this story as well. And of course, as we're getting into 1948, this is the beginning of the McCarthy era, where communism becomes a fearful term, and we have the House of the Un-American Activities Committee being created in Washington, D.C., as they begin blacklisting writers, Hollywood, and others for their proposed or alleged fascination with communism. Now, in 1943, when news of the Nazi concentration camps had finally reached America, a number of Americans responded with horror and concern. They couldn't believe that communities could have stood by and silently allowed the Holocaust to occur. Well, Miss Jackson hints at a similar situation in her story, when the townspeople are unable to fully question or prevent the brutal lottery practice, and in fact, participate in it. Now, in the United States, conformity was the norm post-World War II. Americans tended to imitate those around them rather than follow their own separate paths. Now, the media, especially TV, helped to spread conformity throughout the U.S. They liked to show modern families and the way everyone reacted in the same manner. Now, in politics, people also feared the spread of communism, leading to the Un-American Activities Committee, the Hollywood blacklist, and by 1950, McCarthy's communist witch hunt. Now, in the story itself, in the lottery, the townspeople are swept away by the tide of conformity, and the lottery goes ahead, as always. Now, when we look at the story of the lottery, or of any of the other macabre stories by Shirley Jackson, foreshadowing is one of the strongest pieces of literary analysis you're going to be looking at. Now, foreshadowing is a literary device in which a writer gives an advance hint of what is to come later in the story. Foreshadowing often appears at the beginning of a story or a chapter, and it helps the reader develop expectations about the upcoming events. For example, you see Bobby Martin stuffing his pockets with stones, and the other boys follow suit in the story of the lottery. Now, Bobby, Harry Jones, and Dickie Delacroix made a great pile of stones in the square, and they guarded it against raids. And of course, villagers kept their distance from the stool. They've been there before, they know what the stool means. Now, we have two people who are in charge of the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves. And again, with the idea of symbolism with the names Summers and Graves, that might impend some sense of death. But Mr. Summers asks for help to steady the box. And there's hesitation, probably fear, about even going near and touching the box. Now, there's a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open, demonstrating that the lottery has a ritual. There's certain things that need to be done. Now, we also hear in the commentary in the audience in the lottery, Mrs. Adams says some places have already quit lotteries. There appears to be some sort of controversy and that the lottery was discontinued, that apparently there's a problem with the lottery. But the people have done it so many times before, they only half listened to the instructions of this current lottery. And some were also wetting their lips, whether or not that was an anticipation for what was to come, or downright nervousness at what was to come. Now, we also have a biblical allusion here. Now, an allusion is a figure of speech in which one refers indirectly to a place, event, or an object. Usually, circumstance or literary work is an external reference. So the lottery alludes to the biblical story in which Jesus frees an adulterous woman, directing who is without sin to cast the first stone. And in that story, no one throws stones at her. Now in the lottery, no one stops the stoning, and Tessie becomes their scapegoat. She, in effect, pays for the community's sins. Now we also have the theme of a ritual without meaning. Because there's always been a lottery, the villagers feel compelled to continue this horrifying tradition, and they focus on its gruesome nature, for they still remember to use stones even after they'd forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box. So this story may be saying that society tends towards violence instead of society's need for civilized traditions. There's also the theme here of mob violence. Mrs. Hutchinson's death is a mob action. If it was an individual act, it'd be called murder. But as a group act, it's called a ritual. When Mrs. Hutchinson arrives at the ceremony late, she chats sociably with Mrs. Delacroix, but after Mrs. Hutchinson falls victim to the lottery selection, Mrs. Delacroix chooses a stone so large she has to pick it up with both hands. So on the individual level, the two women regard each other as friends. But on the group level, they betray that relationship, satisfying the mob mentality. We also see this sense of symbolism here, usually with the color of black, which is the color for death, mourning, and punishment. Now the black box used to draw lots in the slip of paper with a black mark pointing out the winner are mentioned way too frequently to be coincidental. So when we look at what takes the idea of black, well, there's the black box. It's old and the paint is peeling and the wood is splintered. Now this condition reflects the fading of the tradition in other villages, as well as this village's questioning of the lottery. However, they won't replace the box, just like they won't stop the lottery. Now, a black box itself, is there some evil secret that's being hidden away? Maybe it's some reference to a casket or a coffin. And then the black spot on paper. The person who chooses it, is it supposed to represent a sin? Is it unclean? Is the black mark on one's record negative? Now, the lottery itself could be a setting. It symbolizes any number of social problems that we blindly continue through, even though they're outdated. And what's interesting about the symbol of the setting is there's no specific name, no specific place of a town, no specific time. This is any town USA. And the contrast of the town with the ritual helps to build suspense. When we look at the names of Summers and Graves, the two people who are in charge of the lottery, when we think of the word summer, it's associated with youth and strength and growth and happiness and warmth, all those positive ideals. And the opposite would be Mr. Graves, which the obvious, the sense of a grave or a place of entombment or death. We can also take the adjective grave equaling serious, which hints that the lottery may not be a frivolous contest. So when we have Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves sharing the responsibilities of the ritual with the lottery, life can bring death, and death recycles life. Finally, we have a parable here, like a simple story that's used to illustrate a moral or a spiritual lesson. Usually we kind of think of parables as perhaps told by Jesus in the Gospels. Perhaps many would believe that the lottery to be a modern-day parable, a story that represents a moral lesson through characters who represent ideas. Now, the focus in a parable is not to develop character or other typical plot elements. You're not specifically told the lesson in a parable. You have to figure out what the lesson is. So what might be one of the lessons? Well, horrifying acts of violence can take place anywhere and at any time. and they can be committed by the most ordinary of people. Maybe perhaps the sense of following the crowd could have disastrous consequences. And of course, the unexamined life is not worth living. Perhaps other themes might be the acts of violence and hatred and murder are just not acceptable because many people participate in it. Society is reluctant to reject outdated traditions and ideas and rules and laws and practices. We've always had them. Why change them? People are not all good, and people are not all evil, but rather a mixture of both. We also have a sense of irony at the end of this story. Now remember, irony is the contrast between what is expected and what is really happening. Now we have three different types of irony. We have situational irony, when what happens is the opposite of what is expected. Now most examples of irony in the lottery are going to be this kind. We also have verbal irony, which is a contrast between the intended meaning of what is spoken and what the apparent meaning is to the person that hears it. And there's also dramatic irony, when the audience knows something that the character in the story does not. So we look at situational irony in the lottery. One of them that we have is the story's setting. June 27th is a typical pleasant summer morning, except for that people are gathering for an event that is anything but pleasant. Another situational irony, it's supposed to be a strict ritual, but over time, parts of the ritual have been altered or even stopped. Another piece of situational irony, Old Man Warner says how primitive it would be not to have a lottery. Next thing you know, they'll be living in caves, he says petulantly. There's always been a lottery. And of course, at the end, when Mrs. Hutchinson screams, "It isn't fair, it isn't right," and then they were upon her. Actually, the lottery is perfectly fair. Each person theoretically has an equal chance of winning the lottery. Now, we do have a couple of pieces of verbal irony as well. When Tessie Hutchinson shouted, "Mr. Summer, you didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." That is ironic. Tessie had just told Bill to hurry up and go get a paper. Now, Tessie's viewpoint changes when it affects her family. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn more about the author Shirley Jackson. If you'd like to learn more about her or about other authors, please leave a comment down below to tell me who else you'd like to learn more about. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed.